we go. My name is Kerry Oien. In my day job, I represent the FBI laboratory. I'm the chief of the Trace Evidence Unit. In my now other day job, I represent the Outreach and Communication Interagency Working Group. If you hadn't noticed by now, based on the comments from the other speakers at the table, there's a whole lot of data collection and idea collection and thought collection going on. This collection, this information, all of this stuff that's being gathered covers the entire gamut of forensic science. And keep in mind, this is not just trace evidence, but the entire gamut of forensic science. The job of our group is outreach and communication. So taking all of that data, doing something with it, communicating that data to you, the users of forensic science. A little bit about our working group. I'm not going to go through every single one, but you can see we have representatives from Department of Commerce, Defense, Homeland Security, the Executive Office, Department of Justice, Treasury, and now National Science Foundation. Okay, the co-chairs, I am one of the co-chairs, along with Eric Steele, who is sitting in the office from NIST, Frank Schultz, who is from the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys, and currently working full-time on this project with Mr. Melson. And then our Executive Secretary is Rachel Voiles, and you will have contact information in a little while. What are we tasked with doing, the Outreach and Communication Group? You've seen some of this information before. We're to develop the general messaging strategy and the talking points, going out to conferences like this and talk about what we're doing. To lead the Subcommittee on Forensic Sciences efforts to host conferences. If at some point in the future when we have product, to have a conference, to invite all of you to come to a conference to talk about the product that we are developing. And finally, to develop websites, and we're going to come back to that in a second. One of the things that we need to do is identify who are the stakeholders. Some of these are very obvious. The government entities, state and local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, other non-traditional government entities that are part of forensic science. But what about the non-government entities, the universities, professional organizations, private labs, the public, the legal system, members of the legal system, and are there others? Okay? These are the kinds of ideas that when I have a little question mark, we're looking for ideas from you. If we're missing some part of our target audience, we want that information back so that we can appropriately target that group. Okay, as I said, the main part of our job will be to disseminate the work product from the other IWGs out to you, the stakeholders. And as you can see, they have very broad taskings and very ambitious taskings, so it will be our job to help them communicate that to you, the community. Okay, and I think this has been said many times, but I want to reiterate it. Of equal importance to the product that they're developing here will be to solicit information from that broader community, all of the stakeholders in the forensic science community. Okay, what are we going to do with that? As I said before, presentations, conferences, the website. Some ideas for how are we going to make this data, this information available to you. Some of the websites. Obviously, the data that's collected by the IWGs will be present. A description or an outline of what is currently done, maybe at the federal government level, state government level, of what are the forensic activities that are happening at each of those agencies, at each of those levels. Something like a user-supported searchable database of forensic science information. And I'll have a couple of examples of websites that you can go to that we are hoping to model ourselves after. but it may have areas for research, to talk about research that has been done, or to solicit ideas for research that needs to be done. News. Are there any current noteworthy news articles? There was just one in Popular Mechanics a couple days ago about the National Academy of Sciences report and the current state of forensic science. Talk about upcoming events. Are there conferences that we should attend? Is there technical literature? We could have the actual literature hosted on the website, or at least provide links so that if you need to find a paper on Raman spectroscopy on a certain type of fiber, you could go to that database, find the link, and get to that paper. Okay, here are the examples of the websites that I was talking about. Very easy to remember, www.biometrics.gov, and the other one is the biometricscatalog.org. If you go to the biometricscatalog.org especially, that's a basis that we're considering to use for the forensic science information. And it has many different facets to the database, but it covers those things that I talked about, the literature, the upcoming events, the newsworthy events. Okay, and this is how the biometrics community handled a similar problem, such as we're addressing right now, in the past. Okay, again, parting thoughts, collaboration from the entire stakeholder community is what's going to be important to this process. We are trying to develop a product that will be useful to you. We want to develop a dynamic product that everyone has the ability to access, to share and obtain this information. I found it interesting that at the very beginning of this conference, I call it Sandy Squared. It was Sandy Parent and Sandy Cook, talked about the survey that they did. One of the first things that Sandy mentioned was a lack of a centralized forum in which we can exchange ideas and analytical techniques. She referenced this conference as a place to do that, but something like this website would be another fantastic opportunity where we can do just exactly that, that centralized forum, a landing point for everybody to get information and give information on forensic science. She also identified that 95% of the respondents in the survey are doing some sort of outreach already. And I would say that it's not just the job of our little interagency working group to do outreach. That is a job of every forensic scientist every single day, to be out there to push our product, to sell our product, and talk about why this is meaningful, why it does need to continue. And hopefully, we will give you some ammunition, some data that you can use in your outreach activity. Here are here's the contact information for the members of the outreach IWG. Again, Frank Schultz, Eric Steele, and myself, and Rachel Voiles. You can come up and get it afterwards. And that's it. I would encourage you all now to take the opportunity, whether at the microphones or afterwards, come talk to us. This is a time where we want to gather your ideas, your thoughts on what we're doing and the direction that we hope to go. Thank you.
Thank you. As you can see, we're an ambitious group, but we can only do it with all of your input. And so we'd like to start with questions, and I assume the protocol is to use the microphones on either side of the room. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Mary Ann Stam from the California Department of Justice Riverside Laboratory. I have several comments and then one question. Comment is, did any of you critically examine the recommendations of the NAS and decide whether or not they really are needed to be addressed? Secondly, NAS consisted mostly of academics, yet it seems as though the recommendations are aimed more towards adding more regulations. And as far as I know, academics do not like regulations. So I kind of wondered, you know, why that came about, first of all, and whether all those regulations are really needed. In particular, I can only speak for trace evidence. Third, I think that basically, with respect to trace evidence, you're trying to fit a square peg into a round DNA hole, and it's not going to work. And you will probably end up losing a number of experienced people because they do not want to be put into a round hole that doesn't fit. And secondly, fundamentally, I didn't notice this in any of your talks, but one of the NAS report's big concerns was that trace could not basically address the question of significance. I did not see in any of the reports, and maybe I missed it, that none of you addressed funding to do studies for example, random matching, manufacturing trends for different types of trace evidence, and some sort of funding or agency assistance in providing a location where we could find out manufacturing trends. And finally, I wondered, why are there no local or state level representatives currently on the IWGs?
Could you repeat that, please? I'm sorry.
I can.
No,
Would
I know
like
you
it?
can. I know you can. Let me ask if either Carrie or Chris want to address the trace evidence issues that she raised, whether we're trying to put round pegs into square DNA holes. And then we'll try and catch the rest of those, and if we miss them, I'm sure you'll let us know.
Marianne, I agree with you that it is going to be, I believe, tougher for trace evidence, especially in the accreditation, or sorry, in the certification and proficiency testing realm. Again, it's something we have to look in the future here as we gather this information, continue to digest the report on, again, how much trace evidence fit in here. Again, with, I believe, the uniqueness of this field. I don't really have a comment on the reporting, be able to possibly provide more statistics, developing manufacturing information. I'll probably defer that to Jeff, and probably falls in the research and development realm.
Well, I'm sorry, before Jeff, you start, let me see if I can answer two of the other questions before I forget them. One is with respect to whether we looked at whether the recommendations that the NAS report made are necessary to begin with. And I think if we did that, that would be jumping the gun and making conclusions for all of you before your involvement. So when each of the IWGs look at the recommendations, it could be that their conclusion is that we've already done this in the forensic community, and the recommendation is not one that needs to be considered any further. That's part of the study. I don't think we can prejudge whether the recommendation is necessary or not. With respect to your question of where are the state and local people on our committee, I just want to emphasize again, we had to go through a particular bureaucratic structure in creating the IWG, which begins with a federal interagency working group, and then because of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, we have to use certain procedures to get the state and locals on board. We have figured that out, how to do it. We're going to begin doing it probably the week after next, hopefully, when we decide and formulate the way in which we are going to solicit input and garner the support of the individuals from the state and local laboratories. So Jeff, I'm sorry to have interrupted you. Do you want to go ahead and talk about the other question?
Marianne, that's a wonderful question, especially the where's all the money going to come from. If you look at, there's a couple of documents out there that talk about how much the government spends on larger research and development, and it's a pretty big number. Within my world of the DoD, we've got like 9 research categories ranging from pure research, phenomenology, understanding how things work, to actually building invisible airplanes over here. And so this gives us a foothold to begin to advocate for more of those resources in the fundamental research to go towards things like forensic science. So I'm excited about that. I think your idea on manufacturing trends is wonderful, and it's something we should absolutely incorporate. I'd love to tackle you on the next break and just pick your brain more about that.
I actually think that's the fundamental question that we need in order to deal with the fundamental issue that the NAS report had, which was adding significance to findings, at least in trace evidence.
Absolutely, right? You're all very skilled.
We need databases.
Yeah, you're all very skilled at characterizing what you see, and the help we need next is, what does that mean? What else can we link that to? And so I think you're right on.
Mark, did you have a comment? It looks like you were
I
ready
did.
to
The
speak.
funding aspect is something which is pretty important, and it's interesting. There have already been 3 congressional hearings, 2 in the House and 1 in the Senate. And being in Washington, D.C., we have the proximal opportunity to meet with the staff ahead of time and actually testify. And I think there's another one coming up soon from the Senate Judiciary Committee. All of them want to ask and have been asking, how much money does it cost in order to implement these recommendations? Congress deals in dollars, so we have an opportunity to do that. Up until this time, none of the panel members have made statements specifically about what the overall cost would be to implement the 13 recommendations of the NAS. We recognize the need to do that, to get Congress on board and support us, and we feel that there's a great opportunity for that to happen. The second is the NSTC seriously takes into consideration the need to do cost estimates, and all 5 of our IWGs have been tasked with that as a high priority. So I can't tell you how soon, but what the cost would be for RDT&E, the cost for standards, the cost for mandatory accreditation. That means that if state and local laboratories are required to certify all of the forensic scientists and accredit the laboratories, how much is it going to cost to prepare to do that? How much is it going to cost to implement it? How much will it cost to maintain it? And we have the opportunity to go back to Congress and say, it's $1 billion to do this, $2 billion to do this. One of the things we've discovered about Congress is that they don't pale at $1 billion here and $1 billion there. That's chump change for them. For the forensic science community, to talk about something in excess of $100 million, which is effectively what Justice for All has made available to every category other than backlog reduction in DNA, $100 million a year to Congress is not a lot of money. So we're prepared to make recommendations at whatever level it's going to be. We've made an estimate of what the operating budgets are of 400 crime laboratories in the United States. It works out to something like $4 billion a year. That's for everything that you're currently doing. So the dollars that we need and the dollars that are currently being expended are something which may not come as a surprise to Congress, but probably will be quite a surprise to all of us if we start identifying what those costs are and share it. So we're not afraid to do that. And hopefully that's an answer to your question, that's primary on our agenda.
So I think we covered most of your questions, if not all. We have a young lady over here who would like to ask a question. Go ahead.
My name is Helen Griffin. I work with the Ventura County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab. And I really appreciate your efforts in the goal to improve forensic science. I agree that there's lots of room for improvement. Having said that, I want to point out that the #1 factor affecting the quality of my work product is how the evidence is initially collected and documented at the crime scene. So my question to you is there going to be equal funding and effort put towards improving crime scene collection and documentation of evidence?
Or if there are no takers, I guess that falls on me. And let me say a couple things. First of all, with respect to the equal funding, our committee will not be the ones that decide what gets funded or what doesn't get funded. We will be perhaps having input into that, but it's in the end going to be Congress that gives money to specific areas, and whether they earmark it for crime scene collection or for DNA research or what is a little bit out of our bailiwick in span of control. Certainly, the point that you make with respect to crime scene is extremely important, because if you don't get it there, if you don't get it right, we've lost the opportunity forever to do the proper analysis. Crime scene search practices and protocols are very important to this committee, as well as to some of the programs that are already in existence, such as ASCLD Lab, which is and has been accrediting crime scene units that are within crime laboratories. But that is something we'll take back with us and look at with respect to how that works into the foundation for forensic science. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, sir.
I'm Peter DeForest. This month marks my 49th anniversary since I started working in the Ventura County Sheriff's Office laboratory, as it existed back then as a little one-room operation with the boss and myself during the day. Things have come a long way, but in some ways they've gone backward. And I want to echo some of the comments that Mary Ann made and Helen made, that we need to pay attention to the crime scene. And in my view, the crime scene needs to be handled by scientists. It is more than the mere collection of evidence. I'm encouraged to hear Mark and Robin talk about the fact that the recommendations of the Academy are not going to circumscribe the entire inquiry here, because I think the National Academy report is naive, it's off the mark, it's missing many, many important areas, such as getting more science into our field across the board. We have some of the major problems that have led to this criticism of our field have come from things like fingerprint examination from tool marks and firearms, where there's a paucity of scientists doing this work. And we need to understand that the whole enterprise, from crime scene to court, needs to be infused with serious scientific input continually. But I am encouraged that at least there will be some money coming, hopefully. This field has been underfunded in my entire career. I've seen this as being something where we were always playing catch up. The demands were far ahead of what was actually being funded. And the fact that the view of the committee is that we will not let the Academy report, with all its flaws, define what the scope of the remediation will be.
Great, thank you, Peter. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Ken. I'm Tom Kubik from John Jay College and the City University of New York Graduate Center. And I have 2 comments, and mixed in will be 2 questions. The first question has to do with the transparency you all talk about, and I think it's very good. I really have to give the committee credit for what they've done so far. But I've heard talk about stakeholders being people like the academic people and the private laboratories and the defense people. So I would like to know if after the funding comes available, all the research is done and the databases are generated, are those databases going to be available to everyone or only to law enforcement agencies? That's the question. Now, here's the comment with the question. I recently was at a symposium at John Jay, sponsored by the Guggenheim Foundation, and Peter Neufeld was there talking about how bad forensic scientists are, talking about his exonerations of bad convictions. And one of the things that came out, and I'll tell you all, we have it on video, is he said, well, we investigated 185 cases of bad convictions. And, oh, it was so bad. And I was saying, well, we have to have defense experts and we need the attorneys. And he said, well, I don't want to rely on the attorneys. He said, because of the 185 cases, I may be off by a couple of numbers here, 165 of them we judged that the defense attorneys were incompetent and bordered on malpractice. So my question is, why aren't we addressing the 165 and 100 out of 185? Why don't we have blind proficiency tests for attorneys.
I would be biased and prejudiced in answering that question, so I'm going to leave it to one of the panel members to talk about blind proficiency tests for lawyers. But let's address the other question first, and that is whether the databases will be open to non-law enforcement. Mark, do you have any vision on that at this point?
For guidance, I think we need to recognize where the authority rests. And I can only speak with the experience that I have with DNA. It goes back to the 1994 DNA Identification Act that empowers the director of the FBI on the authority that is given to him legislatively, and on the advice of a DNA advisory board and on the advice of the NDIS board to formulate guidelines. That, as you know, the CODIS database is open only to authorized law enforcement agencies. There are other types of knowledge databases which should and could currently be open. But in terms of where this resides, I think that I would defer to the Department of Justice and the views of where the authority is given for existing databases and where ultimately authority will be given to databases that don't yet exist. So that is a vague answer, but it's because I'm not an attorney and I'm certainly not a congressional staffer who can give you that guidance. But I think that it will be probably a mixture between databases that protect the information of the individuals whose data are in the database, with an emphasis toward as much transparency as the law allows. So
that's kind of enough.
Well,
no.
Let me jump in here for a second and kind of define the two databases
Sure.
that might be out there. One is a database that may be law enforcement sensitive because it either has Privacy Act type information, personally identifiable information, in which under the law we can't make public to others, or it may involve things, for example, like the DNA profiles, which, if made public, could be misused by other people, and there are laws that prevent the dissemination of these profiles. But if you're talking about what this subcommittee is doing and the databases that we're going to be developing with respect to input from the community, with respect to what research is out there, with respect to what we should be doing, I fully expect that that's going to be open. This administration is has embraced the open government concept. In fact, you can go to whitehouse.gov, I think it is, and look at the Open Government Initiative. So I expect that whatever we're producing, because we're the government, it's not proprietary, and as long as it's not national security or law enforcement sensitive, I expect that that database will be open, because the websites that we're talking about are public websites, .gov and .org.
Something like the paint query database. The paint database.
Yeah.
You're not law enforcement, you can't search the data on paint.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that that we'll be pulling that into our subcommittee. But that may be law enforcement sensitive as well. But we'll look at that. But that's not, I don't think, going to be part of our mission to pull those types of technical or scientific databases in. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jessica Sparacino. I'm a contractor with the FBI. And I just wanted to point out that the company that I work for already has a relationship with a plethora of universities, and they fund research through these universities. So if there's a way that maybe we could shift some of their research focus to forensic science, I'm not really sure what their research is focused in now, but let's use the resources that are already there and those companies who already have these relationships with the government and universities, as opposed to, as we said, reinventing the wheel and going and establishing these relationships ourselves. Some of those connections are already there. As well, I have a master's degree in forensic science, as do many of the people in this room, and being a hair and fiber examiner, I felt like in a lot of, with the exception of the trace evidence course that was offered at my university, a lot of times trace evidence got passed over in a lot of our classes. It was when you go to a crime scene, photograph and do this and do that. And, you know, if you happen to see a hair or fiber, grab that, throw it in an envelope, somebody will do something with it. So I think as we're looking over these degree programs as well, let's make sure that their focus covers a wide variety of the forensic science disciplines instead of focusing so much on DNA and latents. Let's make sure that they don't forget about us too. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments in respect to that? Go ahead.
I would agree. From the education standpoint, we're trying to cast a very large net to find out what exists right now. And if we encounter those universities that have accredited or non-accredited programs that encompass trace evidence, we'll certainly note that. And then we'll be in a position to make an informed recommendation later on down the road. But you bring a very valid point.
And on the next break, I'd love to talk to you more about the relationships your company has with research.
And I also think you brought up somewhat of a subliminal comment when you talked about things that are already in existence out there, and let's not recreate the wheel. That is a very important concept that I think we need to embrace. And was one of my initial responses to the NAS is that we have an awful lot of things that are already ongoing in the community, by the community, or by associations. For example, we have a number of certification organizations ongoing already. We have very widespread accreditation programs that are already in existence. So let's use those programs and other programs so that we can improve those and do it ourselves instead of allowing legislation to come in and impose more requirements on us. I think if we self-police ourselves and work in those areas, we'll do a better job and a more comprehensive job. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a little too short for this, I think. Susie Hanza from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and I thank you for being here because I think that regardless of where we all stand on how we feel about this report, we do need to deal with it. One thing that I think is really important is having cooperation between other law enforcement agencies as well as the community, as well as the courts, and the agencies who are submitting to the laboratories and the laboratories doing the analysis. One thing that's incredibly important is for there to be an understanding of what is available from the laboratories, what type of analysis, and that things of evidentiary value are what are actually being looked at. So I think that having the court systems understand what are of evidentiary value so that it's not in question when someone goes to testify, well, why didn't you do this particular type of analysis? It's understood among the whole realm of all of the people who are involved that certain items are of more importance than other items. And I think that would help with the overall talking about funding and time and efficiency, because if you're working on items that are of real evidentiary value, then you are not wasting time working on other items that are being submitted. And I think that it's important ultimately for some of these laboratories to have some authority in training and also in saying yes or no to items being submitted. And I think that there's a lack of authority right now, or a lack of perceived authority with those laboratories, that they feel that if it's being submitted, they have to do the analysis. And I think that's sometimes a political thing as well as, just a feeling of trying to work with the community. But I think there needs to really be a balance. I also think that that this was something that Ms. Jones touched upon, I think, in her talk, but I think it's really important that non-law enforcement laboratories are held to the same standards, because I think in several disciplines, I think question documents especially has a lot of problems with expert witnesses who do not go through the same rigors that laboratories that are accredited or not accredited, but these are law enforcement laboratories, forensic laboratories that are working with totally different standards. And I think that the standards really need to be the same across the board, no matter who is, involved in it.
All right, thank you, Susie. Do anyone have any comments or responses to her comments? Mark?
I had one. One of the things I think that's important to remember is that we're collecting and gathering data, accreditation and certification, to make recommendations that are either in alignment with the NAS recommendations on mandatory certification and accreditation, or that won't be in alignment, but that will speak to this issue representing the forensic science community at large. Either way, one of the things to remember is that with ASCLD Lab and other focus on ISO 17025, one of the things that is involved is the autonomy that gives the laboratory to make decisions on case acceptance policies that are free from influence by the parent law enforcement organization in which that laboratory exists. One of the things about ISO 17025 is that it requires, for certification, for accreditation, having an autonomous policy with regard to the conclusions that are made in forensic examinations exclusive of the agency which funds it. If you're going to be accredited under international, you need to demonstrate within that laboratory environment guidelines which implement that particular standard. If you don't have that standard in place, you won't be accredited. So this is something which is relatively new and something that I thought I would share with you. If you haven't yet undergone ISO 17025, that's a very important feature of that accreditation, which addresses the need for autonomy and addresses the point that, that you've just made. So hopefully that will be helpful going forward.
I was also very pleased to see in the NAS report that it didn't speak just about publicly funded laboratories, but it also mentioned the need for private laboratories to be accredited and those individuals to be certified as well. So what is good for the gander is good for the goose, and hopefully our process will encompass through the accreditation process both private and public laboratories. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Riedel, and I work for the Oregon State Police Forensic Laboratory in Springfield. And the comment one of the things that I noticed in today's presentations and also in my brief review of the NAS report is a lack of mention of the current equipment and facilities that are available to the 95% of the caseworkers performing not only trace evidence, but all forensic analysis in the country. And from my perspective as somebody who does casework every day and provides that product to the justice system, the strength of conclusion that I can put on that analysis and on my conclusion directly depends on the equipment that I have available to me and the facility that I'm working in. My reality is I'm working in a lab designed for 5 individuals and we have 23 people in it. My reality is that if a piece of equipment breaks, it likely will not be replaced for a very long time, and I will continue to have demands for the product in the absence of this piece of equipment, as we've seen all week, can provide more and more discriminatory power for whatever I happen to be comparing. So my question is this: what emphasis or focus will be in any of these working groups on the the lack of forensic laboratory structures, capital outlay equipment, and is there going to be a Cash for Clunkers program in forensic science?
I love it. Maybe we can divert some of that $2 billion they just put in to the laboratory. Any comments or responses to that from our panel?
I think that's broad across several of the working groups. Again, accreditation, certification, I think in some sense you would want to have the appropriate facilities, the appropriate equipment to do your job. But I think it's also an education piece, also standardization piece in this group, and it's definitely something that we need to look at as we move forward.
Right. The other thing is that we need to create mechanisms in order to provide adequate opportunity for funding for cash for clunkers that you referred to, and Chuck York is standing in the back, and I'm not asking for Chuck to be able to give guidance, but one of the things which is really important is that there is a mechanism for funding for capacity building in laboratories. Coverdale is one of them. CFSO, the Consortium of Forensic Science Organizations, has been lobbying like crazy to try to help to expand Congress's funding for basic equipment that, I mentioned Coverdale, but Chuck knows these programs better than I do, in which the mechanism exists to provide funding at the federal level for state and local to satisfy the need for equipment. And the biggest problem is that it's underfunded. It's not that there isn't a mechanism, but that if you as an agency in Springfield said, I'd like to respond to the solicitation, we have need for about $2 million worth of equipment in our laboratory, where do we go to do that? And the answer is there is already a mechanism, it's just underfunded. There isn't enough money in that program to pay for the equipment for 400 laboratories. The reason that I mention that is that it's part of the responsibility of this group to identify the existing mechanisms and to identify and match the existing needs and make a recommendation to Congress. You guys are doing a great job in providing the mechanism and authorizing it, but the appropriation that you have understates the need by 90% or whatever the numbers are. So I think your question is fabulous and the timing is good. We're responsible, we're charged with the objective and the responsibility for identifying and matching those needs at the state and local level. So we hear you. I'm not sure how soon we can get something in the pipeline, but it's our responsibility to address that very question that you asked. It's a great question, and I hope our answer is responsive.
Yeah. Jeff, did you want to make a comment?
Jennifer, you bring up a great research question in there, too, of sources of human error. You know, I could envision some sort of error rate correlated with square foot per examiner. Might be, you know, it's not an easy study, but that would be very informative.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Yes, sir.
Try to be very brief here and maybe not even elicit a response right now, but I think it was, Jeff, that I heard you speak of operation in a vacuum. You talked about the potential of influence in our decisions based on conversations with police officers and that kind of thing. I would submit to you either I completely understood or I take great deal of issue with that simply because we cannot do our jobs unless we know what the questions are. We simply have to have that information about the scene. We simply have to know what we are looking for. We have to know what the questions are to be answered. So if I misunderstood you, I would appreciate hearing that. If I did not misunderstand you, I challenge you to go back and revisit that issue with a great deal of sincerity.
Okay, Jeff.
That's a really fair concern, right? If you're in a complete vacuum, you've got to know enough about the case to know what you're comparing. I think the challenge becomes, I'll use, you know, maybe a field we could throw a stone at the easiest. If someone who thinks they're doing bite mark says, can you tell me if the saliva found in the bite mark, if there's DNA that matches, that's completely irrelevant and very biasing information. If your expertise is that you really think you can do this comparison, then you should have to do it in the absence of that kind of extra information. And so that's not unique to forensic science. That's unique, you know, that's broad to any observation that we do. So the challenge is going to be identifying those things and trying to weed out what are things that unduly, improperly influence us, give us a confirmational bias, those kinds of things. And it's not an easy thing to do because I agree with you, the baby out with the bathwater idea might be unsustainable too. We have to know enough details about the case to do some examinations.
And I might also add on the coattails of that I think you have to be, as a panel, very aware of our response, because you are telling us that we are no longer scientists, that we are simply lay people that are swaying in the breeze, going with whatever information we're giving, and we're not. We are just as excited to exonerate as we are to prosecute. And personally, I take a lot of offense at being told that you're going to just do whatever somebody says. No, I'm going to look at the science, and I'm going to make a scientific appraisal of that information. Whatever it is, it is. So I just challenge you on that position.
That's a great point. I would just offer you that there are a lot of studies. It's pretty well established that throughout the medical career field, other scientific disciplines, it turns out we do fall prey to that. All of us, even as scientists, we're not as protected from those biases as we think we are. It's not a matter of do we want to be, it's not a matter of do we have impure desires to do something wrong. It turns out we are susceptible to those biases, and I can get you literature from lots of fields that show that.
We're out of time now. Mark wanted to make one comment, and then we'll have to wrap it up, I think, because
I did, and I think, Bill, that your final question is valuable for several reasons. One is that the NAS report identifies contextual bias, so that's something that is of a concern in the criminal justice community. The second point is that there are studies in latent fingerprint examination, for example, where the examiners were told information, and when they were asked 2 months later to make an identification based on the information they were given in this study, I think all but one or two came to different conclusions, and it was clear that it was contextual bias that led to the difference. The third thing is that NIJ has funded, and we have already begun since last October, an expert working group in human factors in latent fingerprints. And among other things, we can help, number one, acknowledge that contextual bias is something that we suffer from regardless of our integrity. And I know that you take umbrage with it personally, Bill, but everyone in this room realizes how high your integrity level is. And I think that one of the things that we can do is to say if we acknowledge that contextual bias might be a problem, we can capture it by creating a model in which you have layered testing. In other words, you have someone in the laboratory who provides the service of getting the context in which the questions are going to be asked, just like you identified. Your years of expertise will help guide an investigator. And then you provide someone with the material to do the examination in which it is totally unknown to that person. The way to achieve that in that particular model is to say you confer with the investigator with one person who has expertise, and when the decision is made of what examinations need to be made, that person who now has contextual bias turns over the examination to someone who knows nothing about the case. So that's one of the models and one of the ways to address both issues.
All right. Thank you, Mark. I think we're out of time. I don't want to hold you up from lunch. This has been very valuable for us. So please, if you have other comments or input, you have the email addresses of all the chairs here. So thank you very much for your time and attention.